Hello everyone, I recently made another custom Super Mario Bros. Wonder level. I had this idea for a long time that I could use condarts and goo in the same level, and then obviously the condarts could destroy the goo in the same way Kongs can, but then I found out that that doesn't really work, so okay, never mind, but I still wanted to use condarts. The candy level theme has these cool looking windmills in the background, so another idea I came up with was putting those into the foreground and attaching blocks to them. In order to do this, I swapped a random object without collision with the mill part, so it could be rotated separately instead of as a part of a preset animation. I didn't want to just use brick and question mark blocks for the windmill platforms, which is why I also decided to have the level feature these blocks. Those pair nicely along with swirly pods, so I also decided to use them. And something condarts do have a proper interaction with is blooms, so those are all the mechanics I decided to use. Now it's time to see the level creation process. I knew that I wanted the majority of this level to take place in the sky, mainly so I could get away with having windmills closer to the bottom of the screen, but I still wanted the level to start out on the ground. This first section here, of course, mostly serves to introduce the main mechanics, though I decided to hold off on the windmill platforms until the sky section. In order to get ideas for what to do with blooms, I of course played through the original game's bloom levels, and I think what's interesting is that even in the first section of this sky level, you're already supposed to pull off a trick that was only for a secret in the original bloom level. That trick of course being jumping on an upwards bloom repeatedly. Even though I partially chose to use condarts and blooms together because they have a very nice interaction where the condarts pop the blooms, this doesn't really come into play in the level that much. There isn't really much I can do about that, since condarts are timing based enemies and blooms move, so as a level designer, getting the two to line up consistently is basically impossible. It's cool how the first area has a bonus room that's not a separate section, but instead integrated into the existing area. Getting up to the pipe in the first bonus section can be really quite tricky, but after a few attempts, I realized it's actually possible by just only holding jump at the right moment, so I decided there was no need to make it easier. There's something about blooms that makes them very different from the type of enemy or mechanic that I usually like to use in my levels. Blooms, at least when they're not spawned from a bloom generator, just spawn once and then move off in a direction, and then they die. This means that, as a level designer, I have very little control over how exactly the player will interact with the bloom during its short lifespan. So if I, for example, put a question mark block that can only be reached by bouncing on a bloom, then if the player takes their time and the bloom flies past, the player will have no way of reaching that block. Nintendo doesn't seem to mind this kind of design, but I personally prefer it if my levels basically have small loops in them, where a player can wait and the same event will happen over and over again for them to interact with. This is all just a very long way of explaining why this level features a lot of bloom generators, but not a lot of individual blooms that spawn on their own. The custom-ish background for the sky section was actually quite a lot of fun to work on. I made it by taking the original Savannah sky background and removing all the mountains from it. Then I looked at how the layering of the normal candy background works and tried to replicate that in the sky area. The bonus room for the second purple 10 coin was truly a pain to figure out. I ended up scrapping my first idea entirely and going with a different design. Something I hadn't incorporated into any of my Wonder levels yet was a P-switch section, so that's what I ended up going with for this bonus room. It's weird because the whole appeal of P-switches, that brick blocks turn into coins and vice versa, is completely missing in Super Mario Bros. Wonder. So the only thing P-switches do now is spawn blue coins, meaning it's really just an incentive for the player to collect coins slightly more quickly, which all in all isn't super interesting. It is funny how Nintendo seems to have been perfectly aware of how confusing it is that P-switches don't affect brick blocks and coins in this game, by the way, because neither of those appear in any of the P-switch sections in the original game, so I also made sure not to include any in this bonus room. Much later during the level creation process, I actually decided to swap the second and third bonus rooms, mainly because the second bonus room ended up being pretty big and complicated, whereas the third ended up being much more simple. In the original game's Bloom levels, the enemies will sometimes go through the ground, so apparently Nintendo considered this to be perfectly normal. Still, it did feel a bit odd having blooms do the same thing in my level, so I tried to avoid it wherever I could. I decided that one way I'd make this level more unique compared to the original game's levels that featured blooms was by focusing on verticality. So this entire level sort of takes the shape of a staircase, where every now and then the level will suddenly switch from progressing horizontally to vertically. The original game's second bloom level has this section where the player rides 2 diagonal blooms up to a very high semi-solid. It's one of the last sections of the level, and the player can try again if they fail. I really wanted to do something similar, but I also wanted to avoid allowing the player to retry if they fell, so to compensate for the slightly higher difficulty, I made sure the blooms lined up in a way that made the section relatively easy. Still, if you do fall and then go all the way to the right, you won't die, and instead be rewarded with some coins and a platform that leads you back to try again, so the setup actually isn't that cruel. Condarts are probably most interesting when combined with blocks they can hit or destroy, so I originally intended on making a section where a windmill was made out of brick blocks that they could destroy. However, I probably should have tested this idea beforehand, because this doesn't actually work, since annoyingly it doesn't seem like destroyable brick blocks can be attached to the windmills. There's an annoying limitation with these bloom generators, which is that they can only create the faster pink blooms, not the slow green ones. A lot of this level's difficulty comes from having to deal with the fast pink blooms, but I definitely would have preferred making the level a bit easier if I could use green bloom generators in some of these sections instead. Something I kind of worried about before starting work on the level, that surprisingly ended up not really being a big problem, is the way condarts interact with moving platforms. Even though there are sometimes blocks that obstruct their path, they never really glitch out or get stuck or anything like that. They behave completely how you'd expect. After the midway, I decided to have a slightly easier section with a lot of terrain on the ground instead of pits everywhere, which does sort of contradict the sky theme, but the level is difficult enough as it is. There's this really cool thing that's only used once or twice in the original game, where one block can store multiple Wonder Buds that each send out a different signal. So since I had swirly pods in the level already, I decided to make a setup where the player could kick a shell into some blocks that would spawn other blocks that move along a windmill one by one. It's really satisfying to look at. Speaking of swirly pods, those snail enemies, I didn't really end up using them in as many interesting ways as I would have liked. The level already has a tough time balancing 2 central enemies, so the swirly pods are mostly just used as generic filler enemies the way Koopas or Goombas usually are. When making this sky background, I didn't test whether it would work with vertical sections, and that was a mistake, because once I made this vertical section, I noticed you could see certain parts of the background float. There was no simple way of fixing this, so I ended up model editing these parts that were cutting off to extend them further downwards. I knew I wanted the wonder effect for the level to have quite a bit of verticality, but I was also pretty sure that the background would start looking pretty odd if we went up any higher, so that's why I decided to make a downward section. Blooms work kind of awkwardly going downwards because they still bounce you very high, and by the time you fall back down, the bloom will have moved down much further. The solution I ended up finding for this later down the line was by alternating the positions of the blooms. So instead of jumping back all the way down to the bloom you bounced from, you will instead line up nicely with the bloom beside you. Someone should keep track of how many times I say the word bloom in this video. Originally, to get to the third bonus room, the player had to spawn additional pieces of a windmill platform so it would line up with a pipe they could then enter. But this setup ended up being removed entirely when I swapped the second and third bonus rooms. This bonus room ended up being super duper simple, mostly because the level already featured 2 large bonus sections, and I realized the second half of the level was going to be much larger than the first either way. Still, it's not the worst bonus room ever, it just isn't really that challenging. The fact that this level uses the elephant suit was definitely a bit of a level design challenge. See, my levels tend to be quite compact, which clashes with the elephant's larger hitbox. So making a level as complicated as this also play well when the player is nearly twice as big was a bit of a pain sometimes. There are actually still 1 or 2 places in this level where if you stand still in a very specific spot, you can get crushed by a part of a windmill if you have the elephant's taller hitbox. Then again, I'm almost positive places like this also exist in the original game, and even if they don't, I don't think it's worth compromising level design for this kind of thing. I'm really happy with how I managed to contextualize these rotating windmill platforms by having them match their look from the background, but this visual did sort of limit where I could use the windmill platforms. Having this giant stack of sweets or ice cream or whatever it is simply doesn't work in every situation, especially because the model for this element doesn't go down super far. So sometimes I had to find creative solutions using background walls or normal terrain to fit the windmill platforms into odd places. Since I knew the wonder effect would mostly revolve around blooms, I decided the final section of the level's normal route would be the culmination of the condart and windmill mechanics. So the idea for the wonder effect was to have the player ride a giant bloom that takes them beyond a goal pole to a sky section, meaning the level would have to feature 2 exits. Personally, I don't really see the point of having 2 proper goal poles in a level if the second goal pole also required you to go past the first one. So I made the first goal pole one of those fake optional ones that don't actually clear the level. Weirdly, giant blooms only function properly when created by a bloom generator that faces to the right, otherwise they'll get spawned at an incorrect angle relative to the generator. In general, it took a lot of finagling to get everything with the giant blooms to line up. The idea was for the player to jump from a bloom that travels up and to the right to a bloom that goes straight to the right, but I hadn't really figured out how exactly this would work ahead of time. I ended up just having to brute force this section by reloading the level over and over again and placing the second giant bloom in a slightly different position each time and seeing if it would line up. The camera for this section is also a big ol' complicated mess, with multiple areas that each track the player in a different way to make it easier to see what's going on in that specific section. Once the player reaches the second bloom, I also made it to where the camera wouldn't scroll down anymore if you fell. Instead, you'd be warped back down and the wonder effect would be disabled. I placed a bunch of these foreground clouds in the level, partially because having these foreground parallax elements just looks nice, and partially to hide slightly uglier parts of the level styling. Part of the reason I decided upon using blooms and these windmills in the same level is that I realized I could bind blooms to the windmills, so this ended up being the focus of the last part of the wonder effect. I couldn't have this just be a normal platforming section where the player would have to bounce from bloom windmill to bloom windmill, because then if all the blooms attached to one mill were defeated, the player would be stuck. So instead, I decided to make defeating the blooms an intentional part of the level's design, making it so the Wonder Seed would only spawn if all the blooms were defeated. I also placed a few condarts in this section, since it would also count if they defeated the blooms, though I imagine some players might get confused by the fact that you don't have to defeat all the condarts to spawn the Wonder Seed. Just like with my last level, I once again ran into an annoying problem when finishing this level, which is that I'd used too many links. But whereas in my melon level, I managed to fix this without having to make any compromises, in the case of this level, I did end up deleting some small stuff, like coins, to make sure all the level's links still worked. Honestly, the fact that this has happened twice in a row now is slightly terrifying. So far I've mostly gotten around it pretty easily, but someday I may have to scrap entire level ideas because of this limitation. I decided it would be a nice full circle moment if the level went back down to the ground for the real goal pole section. It's a bit like how underground and underwater levels work sometimes. As you might have noticed, this level ended up being pretty massive, so adding decorations to the whole thing all at once proved to be a time-consuming process. When it comes to decorating my levels, with the exception of the melon decorations in my previous level, I've always just mimicked exactly how a level with the same theme was decorated in the original game. I am hoping to continue making my levels more and more unique by not only mixing assets from the original game together like I did for this level, but also by making new visual elements myself. However, so far I haven't really found a way of adding additional objects to the game. So therefore, at the moment, if I wanted to make a new visual theme or object, I'd have to replace something from the original game, meaning I couldn't use that asset in my mod. So that's part of the reason why I've been kinda hesitant when it comes to making brand new level themes or assets. At the moment, I'd always have to sacrifice an existing element to make something new. Anyhow, the level is now done, so let's play through it. Okay, so here we go. So yeah, I introduced the blooms right at the start here because it's basically the level's main mechanic, so I think that makes a lot of sense. We also have a swirly pod, and as you can see here, I actually retextured these blocks to sort of look like some kind of candy thing, I don't know. Here, this Condart can normally, well, he's supposed to sort of hit that block, I guess it doesn't always happen. And then the blooms will push the power up over, and there's also the coins they can push. And the reason this pipe is here is also to make sure they don't fall into a pit. Then up here, this secret leads us to a 1-up, which, oh, I just hit that with the swirly pod shell. I didn't even know that was possible. That's like, oh, I'm also very good at the game. Up above here is where the normal route goes if you jump on those blooms, but over to the right here is the secret for the first purple 10 coin. And here I'm just holding jump now, and that's all you have to do to get through that. Though I imagine some people might still struggle with that section, and I mean I sometimes still do quite badly at that as well, so it's fine. Here, I'm just very happy with the way these windmills turned out, the fact that they look so good, and like just, yeah, they match the ones in the background perfectly, even though they're technically a different object, and just, yeah, having the platforms attached to them and everything, it's very cool. So now down here we can already go to the bonus room for the second purple 10 coin, which is interesting how this level has like 2 of the purple 10 coins super early at the start, like basically in the first quarter of the level, and then the third purple 10 coin is like way later on. Oh, I just hit the brick block. You can actually hit both of those at the same time with the Condart, but I hit the brick block first, and that only spawns the coins and not the purple 10 coins, so that's a shame, but oh well. And over here, actually, you'll see that there's another hidden block here, which you can hit with the swirly pod shell as well, I suppose. And you can also normally just jump on the swirly pod to get that instead if you don't have the elephant suit. And now we have this cool section, which, I mean, it might look difficult to do that. It really isn't. I imagine it might be difficult if you're playing in multiplayer, I suppose, because then, like, every time you jump on a bloom, it will get slightly smaller, so that might be a bit of a mess. But I think that's fine. I honestly don't really design my levels with multiplayer in mind necessarily. And here's the only windmill in the level, I believe, that has these cloud platforms. No, I guess there's actually one more later on, but yeah, and there's also another Condart who can just go through the cloud platforms, and there's the midway. I'm pretty sure the midway in this level is actually like pretty early on. Like if you look at how long the level takes to beat, the midway is like maybe a third of the way through. But I think that's fine, especially if you get the fake gold pole, then the midway is more so towards the middle of the level. And yeah, we can go up here for a secret, because of course I love just putting random secrets all over my levels. And this bloom down here can actually be quite a menace if you don't have the elephant suit, because I could just destroy it like that. And I guess that's fine, it's a bit more of a challenge that way. But yeah, this is very cool to look at, obviously, having those blocks spawned like that. This section can be quite tricky, especially because you can still hit the blooms above you as well, and those can also bounce you around, and it's a whole thing. This section, on the other hand, might look tricky, but if you really want to, you can just, like, ground pound here, and you don't have to bother with the Condarts or the blooms at all. But I like showing it off in a more, like, sort of dev-intended way, I suppose. There's a hidden block here, which has Kaizo blocked me on multiple occasions. And over here, we can hit this question mark block, and it's basically intended that that falls down there like that, because it, like, lures you down here, I guess. And there's a Condart over... Oh, well, yeah, there's the Condart, you can see. And that one actually pops one of the blooms usually, so that's fun to look at. If I follow this Wonder Bud over here, you'll see it spawns another Wonder Bud, which then spawns a Brick Block, which then gets hit by a Condart, which then spawns a Propeller Flower, so that's a fun sequence of events. And here we go, here's what was originally the second bonus room, and is now, I guess, the third bonus room. Originally, these blooms down here weren't spaced out like that. There was just like a full layer of blooms, but that actually started lagging my game after a while. So yeah, it's funny how that ended up affecting the level design. And it's fine if you fall down there quite early, because the purple 10 coin is sort of in the middle of that bonus room. It's not fine if you fall down here though. You can actually die if you just keep waiting on those platforms there. And yeah, this is sort of the fake ending of the level. So if I go down here, you'll actually have a Condart, and that hits a Wonder Flower. And the Wonder Flower actually sort of slightly teleports you, which is interesting. I figured out how to do that in the melon level, and I kind of applied it here again. And let me actually show what happens if I jump down here. You'll see that that's actually intended, or at least like that's something that I've accounted for. So there's a talking flower that greets you, and some arrows that point back to this fake gold ball here. But obviously I've now like skipped a large part of the level, or like I've missed out on a large part of the level, so let me also show the wonder effect section and everything like that. I guess I might as well also show what this section here is like normally. So you can jump on the blooms and get up here, and then you jump up here, and then the talking flower actually responds to that appropriately. Okay, and we're back. We don't actually need the con dart to activate the wonder effect. And here we go, we're once again on the giant bloom. I did kind of worry about the fact that this level's like wonder effect isn't really that custom. Like I've sort of tried to make most of my levels wonder effects at least sort of different from how they appear in the original game. And I mean, here you do jump over the goal pole and stuff like that, and you also go from one giant bloom to another, which is like different from how the original game does something sort of similar. And there's con darts and everything, but still, I do get that the wonder section here is maybe not as exciting as it could be. At least I do still manage to sort of incorporate the windmill even here. And now for the more exciting part, I suppose, which is this crazy bloom section here. And getting the camera here to actually line up the way it does was a tricky thing to figure out, but I did end up finding an object that allowed me to have that sort of line up nicely. And yeah, we just have to pop all the balloons every time. Every time you hit one of the blooms, it will actually spawn some coins up above. And there were also still some con darts to have that be like a bit of a challenge, I suppose. And you don't actually have to kill all of the con darts to get the wonder seed here, so I think that's fine. And as you can see, the con dart also despawns when the wonder effect is finished. And if we hit this block over here, which is a little secret nabbit block, you can see that actually there's no way for us to go back to the left there. That's intentional because, I mean, I didn't want the player to just be able to like jump off into a pit or whatever. And yeah, now we're back down here. I guess we've sort of come full circle with how we're back on the ground now after a long sky section. And I guess with that, we're pretty much done playing the level. I just have to wait for this bloom here. And that also means we're done with the video, guys. So if you enjoyed the video, maybe consider leaving a like or consider subscribing or whatever. I also recently started a Discord server, for which there will be a link down in the description. And I also have channel memberships and everything else. But yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. See you later, and bye-bye.